Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be having people trickling along as we go, but I'm going to get started and be uncharacteristically prompt. My name is Kate Brady, and on behalf of the How We Survive initiative, which is based out of the University of New South Wales, I would like to welcome you all very warmly to what is the first of our webinars relating to the Disaster Recovery Almanac, which is about Volume 1, which was launched last year. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm on. I'm on the very beautiful lands of the Bunurong people, so down in southeast Melbourne. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and pay my respects to the custodians of the lands, whichever lands you're on. We're all on in lots of different places on this call today. In 2024, How We Survive was really excited to be able to launch the first volume of what we've been calling the Disaster Recovery Almanac. Actually, the hardest part of the whole thing was not to decide what to do or to find interesting people to be a part of it, but was to choose the name. And when the name was suggested to me, I sort of shook my head at it for a while and thought we couldn't call it anything that weird. And then I looked up the definition of what an almanac is and thought, well, actually, that is exactly what we are trying to do. So we've stuck with it. What we've done is we've invited community leaders, policymakers and practitioners and researchers to all answer the same question. And that question is, what do you think is the most pressing issue that we're facing in disaster recovery that we need to be paying attention to right now? The idea of the Disaster Recovery Almanac is that this is something that we will replicate annually, hopefully for decades. We will ask people the same question for decades. And what we are hoping to be able to see is what are the differences that occur over that time. So not only is the Disaster Recovery Almanac at any given time a contemporary snapshot of what people from a wide range of perspectives with different experiences in disaster recovery thinking, but also historically, does anything change? If we're looking at this in 2050, are we going to see that people are saying, well, actually, we're talking about the exact same things? Or are we going to be seeing people say, oh, gosh, look at how easy it was then? Or are we going to be looking at in 2050 saying, oh, wow, I can't believe that that's the way that they were approaching things then. We do things so differently now. And so being able to build that historical artifact as well as having that contemporary voice at any given time is part of this. The 2024 edition, we've just popped a link in the chat, but chances are, I reckon we've got a sample bias in the group. If you are here, you have probably read it. And if you have read it, you've come along because you want to hear our wonderful speakers having a chat today. But we're also going to put through, we had a really nice email come through today. I'm not sure if she's on the line from Megan at ANU, who is a PhD candidate at ANU. And what she's done is taken all of the texts that have come out of the 2024 edition and generated a word cloud for us with the idea that we might be able to see some trends easily between, Megan's here. Hi, Megan. Between 2020 and 2024 and 2025 when we release it and keep going like that. The 2025 edition is cooking at the moment. It is underway. It is very close to being finalised, and we're planning on launching that in September. But we have three of the very excellent contributors from the 2024 edition here to talk to you today, and that's why you're all here. We have Douglas D'Antoine. He's going to be speaking with us first, then Margaret Morton and Daniel Aldridge. The way today is going to run is we have invited the three speakers to give a pretty quick synopsis of what their piece was. You can go in and read it in more detail if you're interested in it, if you haven't read it already. But then what we want to do is open it up to the three of them as contributors from last year to ask each other questions on each other's pieces of work that they put forward and the questions that got raised out of those different pieces. And then we'll open it up to all of you to ask some questions of our wonderful speakers. If you want to just use the Q&A function to pop your questions in that, Nat, who is here with us helping run this, she's going to be the person keeping an eye on that section. So if you've got anything in there, just any questions, we'll pop it in there. But otherwise, I'm going to get started and introduce our first speaker. So Douglas D'Antoine is Bardi and Jawi man from country about 200 kilometres north of Broome. So he's not actually there today, which is why he's wearing a jumper. He tells us he's in Perth today, and it is the Western Australian version of cold. But following Cyclone Ellie, he was the executive officer to the Fitzroy Valley Flood Recovery Working Group. In 2024, he was the Recovery Officer for the Shire of Derby and West Kimberley, and he's now the CEO of the Mirning Traditional Lands Aboriginal Corporation. Welcome, Douglas.
Thanks, Kate. Afternoon, everybody. And just by way of context, for those that aren't aware, the Fitzroy Valley, that's in the middle of the Kimberley, east, west, valley in the middle. Yeah, and in relation to the Fitzroy Valley floods in January 2023, yeah, they were the worst floods in WA's recorded history, yeah, that caused catastrophic damage to people and property. Yeah, it was quite overwhelming. Yeah, hence, me being involved in that process and so on. And then in relation to the 5 language groups that come from within the Fitzroy Valley, and you've got Bunaba, Gooniyandi, Walmajari, Wonkajonka and Nigina, they all came together at the Oval in Fitzroy Crossing. And in the first meeting that we had with those 5 groups and their members, there were about like 250 people. And then the second meeting that we had about 4 days later, there were about 400 people that were there once the word got out. And there were 2 themes. There were 2 outcomes from those 2 meetings. The first one was that everybody was going to come together, the 5 languages, in relation to the flood recovery. And the second one was that the mechanism by which that was going to be done was through the formation of the working group. And that's the Fitzroy Valley Flood Recovery Working Group that I'll just refer to as the working group as I go along. And what happened is that there were 2 reps appointed by each of the 5 language groups, and then we had a community rep. And that was to represent the people that were in the valley, not from those 5 language groups, 2 business reps, and also the state recovery coordinator. And they all come together to form the working group, 14 members in total, to which I was the executive officer. So that's just the background. In relation to now, the question, what do I think is the most pressing issue in disaster recovery that we need to be paying attention to? Clearly, and in relation to the context, the recovery of the Fitzroy Valley floods, it's appropriate and genuine community engagement. And that's really, really important, in understanding as you unpack that, what it is that needs to be done, by way of flood recovery, how it is to be done, and who it needs to be done by. And that's particularly if you're interested in fit for purpose outcomes. And just a little bit to the side, it just amazes me, how much community engagement occurs, in a response in the recovery space to a disaster, and just generally speaking, where we don't go anywhere near appropriate and genuine community engagement that, I understand that people would be well aware. And then in relation to the valley and the engagement of community, that was done right. It was fantastic, the outcome across the 3 levels of government, local, state and Commonwealth. The benefits were material. They were sensational. They were clearly unprecedented. And just to give you a snapshot of that, from an economic perspective, for every $1, that's spent in the economic space, the social return, the national average is between $3.90 and $4.10. In the Fitzroy Valley, within the flood recovery works that was undertaken, the outcome was 7. And I know people will be thinking, oh, that's just a metric. But in order to be able to understand that number, you've got 260 people, Aboriginal, that were employed, in relation to the rebuilding of the Fitzroy River Bridge. And within that space as well, there were like 24 Aboriginal businesses. So that was the measure, that the work that was done, for the report to be able to be compiled, to be able to get to that number 7 that I just mentioned. And something, read the article, as Kate mentioned, but there's 4 takeaways, if I may, just to point everybody in the right direction. And the first one is that ACCOs, Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisations, are not community. That needs to be the first and foremost. And just to, without beating up the room, just wanted to let everybody know is that there is a big difference between the old people saying what they want and the old people being told by an ACCO CEO what they want. And it wasn't that long ago, we just went to a referendum. And if I could just, let people, in their own time join the dots, and if I could move on from that point, that would be great. The second one, and I'm going into the other speaker's space, so I'll be tentative. It's that there was a lot of courage, demonstrated by community in the formation and the participation of the working group, in the recovery process that needs to be commended. There was a state process, a Commonwealth process, and a local government process, that didn't want to engage just by way, of those instruments, community. But community, had the courage, and to be commended. They stood firm and said, no, we want to be engaged in relation to things that are very, very important to us. And the other one, and this is more from an Aboriginal, perspective. The reason why the working group added so much value is that they were forward-looking. They behaved in a positive manner, with a can-do attitude. And that might be different to some of the Aboriginal advancement narrative that you may be aware, but it'd be interesting to try and reconcile what it is that's out there in the community to how it is that the working group behaved, that were representatives from the 5 language groups that added so much value. So that's also something to think about. And the other one, for me, apologies, for being a little bit selfish, but it was an absolute pleasure to be the executive officer of that working group. Like being in the room with the upper echelon of Aboriginality, it makes the hairs in the back of your neck stand up. It was an absolute joy, and it was life-changing type stuff. So, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks so much, Douglas. I really appreciate your contribution today. But for anyone who hasn't read Douglas's piece, I would really encourage you to go and have a look at that, because he goes into some of the information that he's presented here today in a bit more detail, and has really given us a really great example of the approach that was taken in Western Australia a couple of years ago. Thank you, Douglas. Our next speaker today is Dr. Margaret Morton. Many of you will know her as the Executive Director of the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience, which she was until the end of 2024. And I think we're seeing a bit of a trend already, right? That people move around a lot in this space. Margaret is now the CEO of Gender and Disaster Australia, but she has more than 30 years experience in federal government, private and philanthropic organisations. And anyone who knows Margaret or has even just looked at her CV knows that she has a really deep and enduring commitment to working with communities to ensure that anything that can be done to support them to thrive and be resilient. So welcome, Margaret.
Thanks, Kate. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm standing on Wathaurong country, and Douglas, no offence, but it's actually cold here. It was very, very cold this morning. It was 1 degree. So I do want to pay my respects, because I'm very, very lucky to live here in Ballarat on this land. I also just wanted to, I've got up on my screen up here the actual almanac, and I'm on the contents page. So I'd actually like to really acknowledge everybody else who's on the contents page, because this was a ripper of a read. If you haven't, for some reason, read it, even though you're on this webinar, it's worth another look. And it's just wonderful company to be in. And every single one is a different contribution. And I found myself going, yeah, that's right, to every single one. So that in itself, we could talk about forever. So I decided I had to think hard about what I thought the highest priority really was. And when it came right down to it, I decided to get a little bit philosophical. So I advocate in what I wrote for the need for courage, humility, and respect. And I talk a little bit about what I mean by those words. I remember I was taken back to when I did my PhD, and the people that I met in 4 communities across Eastern Australia talked about, and it's since become a bit of a phrase, the second disaster, that the fire, the flood, of the cyclone was bad enough, but then the help came, and that was worse. And that had me thinking, what are we doing wrong? Why is that the case? So even though I wrote this when I was with Ada, it's become even more poignant now that I'm leading the work at Gender and Disaster Australia, because I have a view, and this is a little bit complex, and I don't think what I'm about to say is incoherent, or it might be, or inconsistent conceptually. I don't meet anyone in our work who works in either preparation, response, recovery, or long-term resilience. I don't meet anyone who's having a laugh, doing it for fun, doing it for the money, doesn't really care. Nobody. Everybody is doing it because we want to make a difference, whether you're a firefighter, a resilience specialist, a researcher. Everybody is doing it for a good reason. And I commend that. And I think we're failing. I think we're failing to reduce harm for the most vulnerable people affected by disasters. And the most vulnerable people are disproportionately affected. So I'm very fortunate as an individual. I have home insurance. I've chosen a spot where I live that's above a floodplain. The world will be ending if I have a flood. We'll be back at Noah's Ark. I'm on a hill. I'm protected from by a whole range of things, from likely fire. I might have a storm, but I'm advantaged. So our most disadvantaged, vulnerable First Nations communities, women and children, single people, the elderly, the disabled, all of these people we dramatically let down. People who buy a home on a floodplain because it's affordable. We dramatically fail to keep people safe, in spite of the fact that we're all good people and we tell ourselves every day we're doing good work. So as I thought this through, I thought, okay, so what has to change? We have to be able to say that to each other, and that requires courage. So the kind of courage I'm talking about is not the heroic courage, which I commend people under extreme circumstances who have that kind of courage. It's the courage to say, we aren't getting this right yet. We haven't applied the lessons properly yet. If I read another review that talks about the things we need to do differently and realise it's the same thing we said 30 years ago, I have great hopes for your almanac, Kate, that it will not say this in 20 years, but we don't yet really apply those lessons. So the courage I'm advocating for is to admit that we are failing, to embrace that expression of vulnerability, to accept that the future is looking catastrophic, and to understand that we need each other. We need the perspectives of our most diverse groups, because without doing this together, we won't succeed. So I'd like to move away from the second disaster. And the way we do that, Kate and I were both at an event last week. There was an exceptionally interesting speaker who spoke about trust. In my view, he was exceptionally interesting. And he spoke about, do governments trust communities? Now, normally when we talk about trust, we talk about, do communities trust governments? And the answer is often not really, or absolutely not. But in this case, it was thrown on its head. And I think that goes to the heart of what I was writing here. I think we have to have a genuine respect for one another. And if we say we don't want to do to, we want to do with, which we say a lot, then we have to sit down and be quiet and listen to locals, listen and respect and trust and build relationship. And that requires humility. It requires the possibility that those of us who've been working in this for many years actually don't have all the answers, and that other people, particularly communities, have a lot of information that we can't succeed without. So I'm advocating for a curiosity, the ability to leave the ego at the door, to listen to one another and to work together. And all of that is courage, humility, respect. You get the gist. So I think we need to change, and we need to do it quickly. In Western Victoria, we have a season in winter that has a high fire danger risk. We're in it right now. Now, as it happens this week, it's raining, but we still have an incredibly severe drought in this area. So I think we need to open the doors, open our ears, sit down and say less. And that's what I tried to advocate for in the chapter. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks so much, Margaret. And I, again, would really encourage you to read Margaret's piece. And I think we can see a trend that's coming here that, many of the topics that Margaret and Douglas are both raising are similar, but coming from different perspectives. And I think that is one of the beauties of this, of being able to bring people with different perspectives and different roles and different responsibilities to be able to have their views.
Sorry,
Al,
Oh,
no.
sorry. I was going to say, we do have a question in the chat, but we can wait till the end if you like. It was directed to Margaret.
Yeah, we might just keep it to the end. We'll pass on to Daniel, and we'll keep the questions to the end.
Perfect. So keep them coming through the chat, guys, and we'll just monitor them and then tend to them all at the end.
Thanks, Nat.
Thank you.
Our last speaker is Professor Daniel Aldridge. You may have seen Daniel ripping around the country over the last couple of weeks. The poor man, it turns out, has not slept for about a week. He sort of did a big tour of Australia, went back to the US, and is currently beaming in from Japan. But Professor Daniel Aldridge is a leading political science based at Northeastern University when he gets home, which is not that common at the moment. But he's an award-winning author of 5 books, more than 60 peer-reviewed articles and opinion pieces for the New York Times, CNN, the Huffington Post, and many other media outlets. Many of you will know Daniel's work in Australia around social capital and disasters, because he's one of the people who so many of us have drawn on his work, both in research and in practice. So I'll hand over to Daniel now.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here. If I'm incoherent, it's not you, it's me. I literally arrived in Japan about 20 hours ago, so it's been quite a rough week in the international jet lag scene. But in any case, an honor to be back, and thank you again for having me. I think my piece really tries to summarize what I've seen as someone who went through a disaster now 2 decades ago, and since that moment has since tried to study what it means to be someone who survives in a community that does or doesn't show resilience to a shock. And I think what I'm about to say very much resonates with what my colleagues have said already, which is that, a lot of the work that we're doing, and I say we in the sense that I mean national, regional, local councils, whether in Australia or North America or Japan, right? In all of those places, a lot of the work that we do seems really to miss the core engines and drivers of resilience and recovery. And I think for whatever reason, we get stuck, or we've been stuck for quite some time. And the idea is that somehow we can build our way out of shocks, or we can technologize ourselves out of shocks. So new apps, right, new early warning systems, new technologies will get us there. And I think at the end of the day, my own experiences and also the work that I've done has proven to me 2 aspects, 2 elements that are so critical. One are the ties that connect us. We just heard about this idea of trust, right? Do governments trust their people? Do we trust our governments? That's certainly one part of it. I call that a linking tie. But also in the community, to what degree is the community itself? Are the unified, cohesive, interactive? Are the people who regularly get together for, a sausage sizzle, as I learned this summer? Those kind of events that are very Australian. To what degree is the community itself connected internally, and how also are they bringing in new people, right? So a new migrant to Australia, someone who's arrived as a student and stayed to work, someone like myself, to what degree are other groups being incorporated into that work that we call those bonding, bridging, and linking ties. And then beyond that question of social capital, the broader question for me also is thinking about to what degree do we know where these ties are being built? That is to say, we don't typically build many ties online. As much as I love this Zoom call or Teams, whatever we're on right now, the reality is many of us spend many hours a day on computer screens, whether it's on a WhatsApp group or Threads or X or whatever. Typically speaking, those are very shallow interactions that we have. And many of the most important interactions, especially during disasters and shocks, are, of course, in-person interactions, right? So if there's a heart attack in my complex, someone in my complex is going to respond. If there's a flood coming, we need to get out. It's nice to have internet friends, but they're not very helpful in those moments, right? When we really have pressing needs on the spot, getting people out of harm's way, helping people with medical cause, getting them food, water, and shelter, providing psychosocial support and care. Those are very much in-person kind of activities. And the second part of my work beyond social capital has been what we call social infrastructure. Those are the spaces and places in society we build these kind of connections. So think of a local park or a pub. Think of a library or a neighborhood house, right? These are spots you can enter or go in Maybe you've got to pay for a coffee or pay for a gym membership, or maybe it's free, like a library or some public schools. But what we've really tried to do in the research is show objectively and quantitatively that both these elements, the social ties that bind us together and the social infrastructure where we build them, their presence, their quality, and their density very much impact those outcomes of people. As Margaret pointed out, we definitely need to have groups in our society that are vulnerable. Again, in each society, those might be different people. But we also know that those vulnerabilities, in many cases, can be made up for by strong social ties that interact and save their lives. My own research here in Japan, for example, showed that even though most of the victims who did die of the tsunami were over 65, in many communities, no one died over 65 because the cohesion meant that before the tsunami arrived, local communities literally put those elderly people on their shoulders, on their bicycles, on their backs, and got them uphill before that arrived. So it's absolutely true. We have communities that we're not doing well with, but at the same time, in areas, in spaces where there is cohesion, where there is the strong sense of shared vision, we do see an ability, in a sense, to overcome those problems. So I'll wind down now. But again, for me, what I'm trying to write and talk about in this very short piece was this idea that oftentimes we get entranced as a society by things that we can cut a ribbon on, large-scale projects, berms, dams, airports. I myself am very much involved in the DRF, and I'm very sad the degree to which DRF spending this year, for example, is not on social infrastructure, but on things like airports, roads, dams. I think again, a miss here in Australia more broadly, but of course it's normal, business as usual in North America and Japan as well. Those other nations also spend a lot of money on berms and dams and roads and thinking about disasters in terms of gray concrete rather than the people that really make up our society. And of course, we know at the end of the day, it's the power that we hold as residents here that really get us forward. So thank you. I'll stop talking there.
Mate, for a fellow who hasn't slept for a really long time, it was incredibly comprehensive. So thank you. What we've invited the speakers to do is to make sure that they reviewed each other's work, as it were, because while I could sit and fire questions at them all day, and I'm sure you could all too, I want to give them the opportunity to ask each other questions about their work, and then we'll open it up to the questions that have been asked through the chat. So Margaret, Douglas, and Daniel, I would invite you to unmute yourselves and have at each other in the, I'm sure provoking and collegiate way that you will.
Thanks, Kate. Because Margaret, can I ask you initially?
This is a bit nerve-wracking. Yes, of course you can.
It is, but it's intriguing, and it's that relationship, that trust, that government may or may not have opposite community. Yeah, and something for me that stuck out like the proverbial the last 2.5 years of the work that I was doing is that, like, within the political space, especially where government is concerned, is that where there's a tension between what's right and what's wrong and what's popular, that potentially the what's popular prevails to the detriment of minority groups.
I couldn't agree more. Was there a question embedded in that, Douglas? Just what do I think of that?
How are you going to fix it, Margaret?
And then because
that
it was just a sense check, and then it sort of goes back into Daniel and what you've spoken about, Daniel, like how do we, opposite the powers to be that I just referred to, how do we make that change? Like how do we evidence, especially from a kinship, Aboriginal, where you've got that huge human capital opportunity, that those are the right paths to go down.
Douglas, we did not, for everyone else's benefit, we didn't share our questions for each other. So we're going to have the same questions for each other. I have a theory that we will, because I had a very similar question for both of you, Douglas, because I do think, when I reread the bit that I wrote, I thought, if you didn't know me, you'd think I was a deficits-based thinker, because it's a pretty deficits-based proposition to say we need to be braver and listen and we're getting it all wrong. And I'm not actually. I fully believe that, communities stand up after the most devastating events over and over and over again. And some of those people have written in the almanac. Indigenous people have great knowledge to share. People with disability are really influential in their own communities and are really often very well prepared and can help other more able-bodied people. So it's not that I'm a deficit person. I'm all about strengths and capability. What annoys me and frustrates me at the moment is, how do we change this, the way this system works? If I can, I don't know the answer to that. I was thinking this morning, because we knew this was coming today, about a completely different policy area that I used to work in. It was around early childhood, and in particular child abuse in institutions in this country, Daniel. It was a big moment in policy where the change happened after decades of advocacy, because I was inside the bureaucracy at the time and there had been decades of advocacy. The change that eventually happened because of one person, a minister who said, in my watch, we're going to apologise and we're going to do it publicly, and then we're going to change the system. Now, I'm not saying that that system has completely changed, but it was a decision made by one person. So I'm starting to wonder, do we have to just find that one person? But then I don't just want another apology. We've had a few apologies in this country, and then nothing else happens. So it's the question for me, Douglas, is really about, what more can we do? We have really good examples of strength and collaboration and courage and humility and we have really good examples. Why are they then not supported to happen everywhere? Is it the one person model or is it something else? I don't know the answer.
Daniel, did you want to add anything to that?
I did. First of all, everything that's been said certainly is real, and I'm on board. I'm curious, both for Douglas and for Margaret, when you think about the Australian disaster space over time, with the work that we're all doing, and I think, I say we, communities, residents, the organizations that I've met, and I had a chance to interact with a few different ones, sort of NEMA and AIDER, and a few, I see pockets in Australia where these issues are being hashed out. And I'm wondering, where are the bottlenecks, right? I recognize that, again, in my perspective, I'm a cynical person. So I would say there's probably a political economy of disaster, right? Certain businesses make more money, right, when things aren't going well, or certain businesses that do reconstruction work get more money, let's say, than local libraries and NGOs. Where do you think are the bottlenecks here in the broader policy space, right, to a real breakthrough through an innovation and way forward?
In a way, I think you mentioned it earlier, Daniel. I think the thing that I keep thinking about that gets in the way is that you can't cut a ribbon. Well, you can actually cut a ribbon in front of a library, but for some reason that's less appealing to a politician. So for me, it's about, our political, at the risk of making this really hard, our political cycles are short term. Our politicians come and go, and nobody thinks long-term system. Well, not nobody, but there's not enough thinking about long-term systemic shifts, and there's not enough investment in the social capital side. We're all on the same, singing from the same song sheet. There's not enough investment in the things that we believe will firmly believe will make the difference. We still live in a world where we're building in the wrong place. There's so many fundamental and basic things that we're doing badly. I don't know what the bottleneck is, other than maybe it's just hard to change from doing what we've always done. Maybe it's some kind of version of bias to not really see that we have to do everything differently. It'll be okay. We'll work it out. I don't know. Maybe we're just thick as a population. I don't know if that's an Australianism, but
yeah, something that I found was that in relation to, and there were many government departments that are engaged, in the flood recovery, that local, that state, that Commonwealth space. And something that I found is that, like, some government departments were more nimble, than others. And it's interesting, like some government departments that are quite hierarchical, were nimble. But then there was others that I came across that they'd spent 15, 20 years getting their systems and processes in place. and that was their comfort zone. And then all of a sudden you had, an individual from community, being me, coming along and saying, in relation to all of that work that you've done the last 15, 20 years, you need to make an adjustment. Yeah, and that sort of spooked, the room, that spoke that government department. But then sort of going back, Margaret, in relation to that individual, that single person, in the government side, yeah, I think that's more so like the answer. But then what I was thinking is from a, holistic, from a community perspective, if we're going to be, and this is as broad as it gets, yeah, if we're going to be taken seriously in relation to one aspect where we engage, where we interface with government, yeah, we need to, be, professional, need to be respectful, yeah, across every, aspect in which we engage with government. So from that perspective, it's a united front where we benefit, yeah, from the individual opportunities.
Daniel, Margaret, did you have a question that you wanted to ask your fellow presenters?
So mine was kind of this question about the bottleneck. But then I'll flip the question around and say, could you maybe each name, since I can be gloomy about this, can you each maybe name one organization or institution or community that you both think are doing well? Margaret and Douglas, like a place that you looked at and said, aha, this community has, or this organization really has this secret sauce. They are making it work despite, right, the political economy.
Bunches of them.
Maybe just one from each, because I know we're short on time. Maybe just one.
So I would name FRRR. So I think they're a fantastic organisation, and they're in many communities, Daniel. So the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal. If you've not met Natalie Eggleton, the CEO, then next time you come down under, you should absolutely insist on meeting with her. She is fantastic. I would name them as the organisation that I think is doing a really great job all over the country. There you go. There's my thought. God, I hope she's not on. She didn't give me $50 to say that.
Yeah, and then Daniel, for mine, yeah, across the entirety of the response and the recovery in relation to the floods, yeah, the Department of Fire and Emergency Services. And when I spoke about being, hierarchical, being like regimented, yeah, that was the organisation. If somebody said to me that they've got nimble within their space, I would have said no. But they just head and shoulders did exceptionally well in relation to any adjustments that might needed to be made that were Fitzroy Valley specific.
And it's interesting, Daniel, I would also name the reasonably emergent group, the National Indigenous Disaster Resilience team by Amy Williamson and his team. Again, if you haven't met them, next time, because I think we need to really start listening to our Indigenous leaders across this country, and he's working very well to change the invisibility of our Indigenous people. And you, Douglas, also have done a fantastic job there. So there's all sorts. There's some disability work that Michelle Villeneuve's leading at the University of Sydney that has been groundbreaking, and all of the various people living with disability who've worked on that project are making it. There's like heaps of positive. We could do a little positive cell, a positive almanac of all the wonderful things. I had a question, Kate.
Yes.
To make sure we all have a go, and then I'm also trying to be aware of the questions in the chat. It's similar. It's quite similar. My question was going to be of you, Daniel, to say, what do we have to do? There's evidence of the value of social capital. There's evidence of, and most people online will be nodding furiously, I imagine. There's evidence of how important it is to have all of these bridging and bonding ties. We kind of know what we should be supporting. My question is similar to what we've already been discussing. What on earth do we have to do to get it funded?
Yeah, I think we need politicians to recognize the cycles that we're in, whether it's because, again, they have supporters who are in these firms, or because this is what they know the standard operating procedure in the past has been a certain way. I think we need to sit down individually or in groups with politicians and say, look, right, the disaster space is changing. The number of threats and risks that we face are rising. Vulnerabilities are rising. Here's the data. here's what we found. We in the field, and maybe everyone, all 60 of us on this call right now, completely agree. I think a politician might say, well, that sounds pretty good, but, and then have this a sort of a moment of hesitation when that vote comes up, or the bureaucracy builds again, the DRF funding, when more than half of that money is going to go build roads. So that decision's being made someplace. So I think until we sit down as a field or as a community and say, look, right, we understand the need to cut a ribbon someplace, but here's what the community wants. Again, that's building out of their desires. Here's what the data say, right? Here's what the research say with those individual researchers, speaking to them directly. I think we're going to have two sort of a bifurcated world, right? Where those of us on this call right now are all on board. Yes, people really matter. We need communities to be organized. That's great. And then we have, next DRF3, and it's going to be, again, 2/3 goes to an airport in Queensland or whatever, and 1/3 is trickle down to do some small studies across the country.
Yeah.
Thank you to the three of you. We are going to open it up to the floor now. Now, people have been putting some questions in the chat, so I'm going to hand over to Nat, who has been keeping an eye on that to facilitate this section.
Good. Thank you, everybody, and thanks for the wonderful discussions. I'll jump into the Q&A part of it, and we can start, if you're comfortable. I can read out your name if you've put your question into the chat, and then you can ask directly if you'd like to be on board. Otherwise, let me know and I can speak on your behalf. But might start with Andrew McIntyre, if you would like to ask your question to Margaret, just to have a bit of discourse here.
G'day, Margaret.
G'day.
Your reference to the second disaster, and I was just a bit unclear about what the issue was. Is it that fundamentally that we're not actually addressing people's underlying causes of vulnerability?
So thanks, Andrew. The reference that was made to me at the time, the way community members talked to me about it, they were more speaking about the way that recovery occurs, causing them greater distress. There were lots of examples of how. So sometimes counselling being pushed early as a thing that everyone should access, and then a lot of you will know some of this, and then being removed at the first year anniversary when the funding runs out, when actually lots of people are so busy trying to get their lives back on track, they don't really feel ready for counselling support until it's almost over or until it's gone. There were, simple things in evacuation centres, which a lot of work's been done to improve, being asked their name 100 times and having to tell their story over and over. It was more about the way services, donations, a whole lot of things that we have learned from. It was more about that, but I actually really like what you've posed. I think an additional element to the disaster is exactly as you've described it, that we're not understanding, and if we understand it, we're not doing anything about it, that the underlying disadvantages and vulnerabilities for particular areas geographically and particular parts of the population contribute to them having a disproportionate impact or experience of the disaster. So, people who live in insecure housing, people who don't have the same financial resources as others. There are all sorts of inherent people who are still, Indigenous people are still subject to racism in this country of ours. And now that I'm in gender and disaster, there are lots of disadvantages faced by women and by LGBTIQA plus people, both before, during and after the disasters. And those things are also not being addressed effectively. So that's not what the original communities meant when they said the second disaster, but I would say it's another layer of the disaster that's happening now for sure.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I'm currently involved in the disaster recovery for the floods on the mid-north coast.
Yep.
And I'm with a disaster recovery organisation, and all of those elements I'm seeing on the ground, like doing damage assessment, and half of the sites, they're people with disabilities.
Yeah.
And the racism and the discrimination, I'm with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Andrew. And thank you for Margaret. I'll go to the next one. Kerry, would you like to jump on? Otherwise, we can just read that out on your behalf.
You can read on my behalf, thanks.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Okay, so Kerry's asked, the communities like Lismore built community long before disaster hit. They had connections and a sense of efficacy developed through the anti-CSG movement. It seems we can learn so much from those communities who are focused on community outside disasters. Do you think we focus enough on building grassroots community outside the disaster framework? I might open that up to either one of you. Do you have a comment, question on this to respond to Kerry?
So, Kerry, my view would be if you build a strong community, it doesn't actually have to be done through a disaster lens. A strong community will be stronger during, through, and after an extreme event of any kind. So, we could go right back to basics and just invest a lot in building the sorts of ties that Daniel talks about. We could just build community, and those communities will do better, 100%. We have examples, lots of them, where, and I'm going to try and do two things at once, which is never a good thing to try. If you haven't heard of the Disaster Wise Network, check them out if you just Google Disaster Wise Network, because the purpose of that network is to connect communities to one another. Now, it is in a disaster context, but it's a great idea. And we know lots of examples, Douglas, we all know lots of examples, all of us online, of communities that are really pulling together. It's just that without the support externally, we end up with a lot of very exhausted community leaders, completely overwhelmed because they're trying to carry their community. I loved it, Douglas, when you said, an ACCHO is not the community, because I keep saying to people, the local council, with deep respect to local councils and ACCHOs, is also not the community. Neither is the local Rotary group the community. Communities are diverse and complex creatures. So I don't know if that helps answer the question or whether anyone else wants to add to it.
Yeah, if I can add to that, it's an emphatic yes from me, to build up that community base. And one of the challenges is that if you are the jack of all trades, then you're the master of none. Yeah, and that's why you've got to be careful in relation to leaders, individuals, how you utilize them. But then it goes, Daniel, back to your point, in relation to that human capital, and just the capabilities out there, but how do you bring it, into the conversation, into that community space?
I might jump in here just because it might encapsulate the next question, which came from Phoebe. This might be a secondary link, but what first steps do you believe are key to building back strong connections? And I feel, just as you said there, Douglas, that might be leading into that little bit of a social infrastructure, social capital lens. Don't know if Daniel, maybe you want to speak to that, or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of ideas. One of the ways I've seen some communities in North America begin with this question is by, in a sense, cataloging what they have. And oftentimes, to really get this across, they'll take the time out and build their own, in a sense, map of the connections they have there, or the weak and hot spots that they have. If they know, for example, there's a community there we have in Boston, a lot of Haitian Creole speakers who've come from Haiti, right? As conditions are deteriorated there, and we know that there's a very strong bonding, but weak bridging and linking ties. So to have the communities involved in mapping, and I think the phrase we use is nothing about us without us. So that we don't want people speaking for the community. We want the community to hold their data, to hold what's going on, and to be the first people who can say, here's what we know about our communities. Here's how we want you to engage with us. I think that's a very different paradigm typically than, again, an often top-down, I would call it sort of emergency command and control kind of moment, which often comes out of the military, out of police, out of other armed forces, which, to be honest, in many cases are involved in disasters. Many of the government officials I've met across countries have come from those kind of backgrounds and sort of expect a top-down process. And I think really building this bottom-up culture of resilience, building a bottom-up culture of data collection as well, where the community knows here are the things that we think are important about our community. I see a lot of questions here about about gender, for example, questions about different community demographics, that's being held by the community in ways that the national and regional governments just don't have the time or interest in, and maybe not even knowledge of, right? Especially as community demographics shift on the ground. So I think that's a really good start for me, at least, would be this idea of the community itself should be the driver and the repository for this information about what's going on there.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for that, Daniel. Phoebe, do you think that answered your question, or would you like to elaborate further?
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Daniel. It was beautiful. Yeah, I think there's a big rise at the moment in communities becoming disconnected, particularly with, we're seeing decline in birth rates. We're seeing people having a rise in depression. And it's really clear that connection is key in the disaster space and in resilience and recovery. So thank you so much for that. That was great.
Okay, so next one on the Q&A. Megan, it seems that Margaret may have answered this one for you, but would you like to jump in and elaborate on this question, or are you happy for me to?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Hi, everyone.
Thank you so much, by the way.
Yeah, it was really just an invitation for Margaret to expand on her input in the almanac, given your role in Gender and Disaster Australia, about those concepts of courage, humility, respect. You also mentioned urgency and vulnerability in your piece as well. Those bring to mind quite prominent gendered connotations in my from my perspective. So I just wanted to invite you to expand on that.
Thanks, Megan. We're doing a lot of work at the moment behind the scenes. I've been with Gender and Disaster Australia since February, and we're doing a lot of thinking about what we think our next 5 years should look like. We're very focused, for anyone who's not familiar with us, we are completely focused on eliminating or reducing the harms that can cause in addition to a disaster. It's a bit like the phrase of the second disaster earlier, as well as the disaster itself, just because of the gendered stereotypes that we might hold about our own gender or about other people's genders. And we know that if you're a woman, you are, based on our own research after Black Saturday, when I say our, I mean the organisation I've inherited, so it's not really my research, you're 7 times more likely to experience violence in the home, in an intimate relationship, than you were in a community not affected by the fires. And it's horrendous in this country, the statistics around violence against women anyway, let alone multiplying it by 7. Now, we know of examples where women have been violently attacked, assaulted in evacuation centres or in the process surrounding an evacuation of a community. We know LGBTIQA+ community members have also been assaulted or denied access to simple things like toilets. It just does my head in that we can't share toilets. I don't know about the rest of you, but the toilet in my home is used by anyone who visits me or lives here, regardless of their gender, and everybody manages. So I just don't understand this topic. We are now looking at all sorts of research that we'd like to undertake. We know that some of the men in the emergency services sector suffer trauma and mental health challenges as a result of their volunteering or their serving and what they see and have experienced. So there's a lot of issues based on gender where, again, we have assumptions, biases, stereotypes about one another and about ourselves. We know that women die. There's no gentle way to say that as a result of their caring responsibilities. We know that that has happened. And it's not just as a result of violence. What I mean is they perish in the fire because the car that they would normally use to leave with the children has been used to drive their partner to the fire station so that he can volunteer. Now, he's not doing that on purpose. He has to get there to volunteer. But these assumptions we make and the lack of planning that we take, they're all gendered, all of them. so much needs to change. And until we think about our gender lens, we don't think about the consequences of simple behaviours and how to protect and support each other through all of that. So, Megan, watch this space. There's so much that we are now planning to do to shine a light on all of those issues as additional issues that occur during and after a disaster. I feel like that's an inadequate answer, but thank you for thanking me anyway.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Margaret. Now, I note, Kate, we've got 5 minutes left of this meeting. There are 2 more questions. How do we have time to do those, or would you like to?
Let's have a go at one, and fast answer is a good answer, so we can try and get to.
That's what I feel. Okay, great. So I think maybe I'll jump up to Mel Bloor. This, because I think that just ties into a little bit what we're talking on that gender lens. Melanie, do you mind if I go ahead and just read this on your behalf, or would you like to jump in quickly? We're knowing we've got
go for
4
it.
minutes. Yeah. It was
go, Natalie, go. You've got this.
All right, we're going to like race the clock. So a recent paper from the Centre for Rural Health has identified the fact that most of the community resilience work is carried about by women. Do you think it would be fair to say that this is the patriarchal system that ignores and belittles the unpaid work of women that is really the problem? Again, Margaret, it may be more tailored to you, but feel free to jump in, Daniel or Douglas.
We all agreed to have this recorded, didn't we? 100%. 100% agree with you. And I am not saying all men are bad. I'm not saying that at all. But we have a patriarchal, system that's been in place for the last couple of 100 years. This is not the system that has been in place across the globe. There are alternatives. But for whatever reason, I'm not a historian enough to be able to explain the various wars and political events that shaped Western culture. But for whatever reason in Western culture, we do have a patriarchal system. We also have largely a capitalist system, and both of those contribute to everything we are talking about. So 100% we need to change that. We do have women leading recovery, and if you're thinking about the article that I've posted somewhere in the chat, and if not, there is an article posted somewhere in the chat that Loriana, the research manager at GADOS, has been a part of the team that released this paper last week. Yes, overwhelmingly, and some of you, I believe, are online, overwhelmingly women lead recovery processes. Overwhelmingly, they step up during a crisis and form a team and end up working for years to build recovery and resilience in their local community. Overwhelmingly, these are led by women. Yes, there's a lot to be said about that. Good job, women, and excuse me. We need...
Yeah, and if I can just validate that point in relation to the working group, Mummaji Hand speaks 7 cultures, was clearly influential in relation to that role. And then backtracking to DFES, that I mentioned, you've got Mel, you've got Kate, and you've got Bernie. Just if it weren't for them, I wouldn't be in the job that I am now. I'd still be back in the valley.
Thanks, Douglas.
Let's see. Sorry, Daniel, did you have it to jump in?
Just to add to both what Douglas and Margaret pointed out, I think, again, here, knowing what's going on, i.e. having a bottom-up knowledge of the community, having the data there to show that women's involvement is critical and core, is the first step toward trying to rectify that and getting men involved as well and trying to fix the broader system. We need to have that information collected regularly and in a way that's convincing to decision makers to get them to see the system as we have it. It's not going to be sustainable.
Yeah, fantastic.
Well, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to call it there because we have 1 minute until the end. Thank you for facilitating the questions, Nat. And I just want to say thank you so much to our speakers, Margaret, Douglas, and Daniel, for giving us your time. You gave us so much of your time by planning your contributions, writing them, going through the editing process. So I really appreciate all the work that you've contributed there. And to all the people who've been able to dial in today, we are going to be putting this recording up on our website. The website is howwesurvive.com. So if you go into there, there's a part where you can subscribe to getting the updates from How We Survive. So so that you'll be able to see not only this recording, but when Volume 2 is launched, you will also get notifications from there. If I can encourage you to have a look at last year's edition, because there are 12 really great pieces from from a range of contributors, and I hope that you get something out of it. I really hope that in 2050 or whenever it is that we're able to look back and go, God, can you imagine a world where you're having to deal with this? Like, what were they thinking? I'm hoping that's what happens. Thank you so much to everyone for coming along today. We're going to leave it here, but please feel free to get in touch if there's anything that we can help you with. And thanks again to the speakers.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much,
everyone.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.